Imagine a world where you could kill a man in broad daylight, in front of your neighbors, and walk away completely free. His crime was not theft, nor betrayal, nor harm to your family. His crime was a word, an insult, but it was no ordinary insult. That word cut to the core of your being, questioning not your courage in battle, but your role in bed. It implied you were submissive, sexually passive. And in the brutal world of the Vikings, that accusation was not just a stain on honor, it was a death sentence recognized by law. This was not the chaos of barbarians. This was the law, a social order built on a shocking premise. A man's worth was measured by his sexual dominance. To understand Viking society, we must throw away modern notions of honor and law. Instead, we must confront two concepts that shaped their every interaction: urgi and ragr. On the surface, they might translate as effeminate or unmanly, but their true meaning is much deeper and more dangerous. They not only describe behavior, but also designated a specific role, that of the man being penetrated in a sexual act. Being called a ragr was the worst accusation a Viking man could face. It was more than a personal insult, it was legal annihilation. Viking laws, such as the Icelandic Gragas, were very clear on this. An accusation of ragr was considered an insult of the highest legal standing. When a man was accused of such a crime, he had two options: challenge his accuser to a duel to the death, a holmgang, to clear his honor and blood, or accept total social annihilation. If he did not act, his silence was considered a confession, and the consequences were terrible. A man branded a ragr was stripped of all civil rights. He lost the right to testify in court. He could not inherit property. He could not bear arms, the most basic symbol of a free man. He essentially became a social corpse, a ghost walking around his own community, shunned and despised by everyone. Why does a sexual concept have such tremendous legal power? Because in the Viking worldview, everything revolved around power and domination. Their society was built on conquest, plunder, and imposing one's will on others. The ideal Viking man was the one who took the initiative, the conqueror, the infiltrator, both on the battlefield and in personal relationships. Therefore, ragr was more than just a sexual orientation. It was the complete opposite of the Viking nature. It meant that you could be conquered, subjugated, turned into a woman. In a culture where the distinction between predator and prey was absolute, to be considered prey was to cease to exist. So the axe that fell on a man's head for an insult was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was the cold, logical enforcement of an unwritten but all-encompassing code. Violence was not a disruption of order. It was the instrument by which it was maintained. Before any sword was drawn, before any village was burned, violence was first institutionalized in the law itself, an invisible axe hovering over every man's head, forcing him to constantly prove his dominance or face total annihilation. This system created a society in a state of constant tension, where aggression was not only encouraged but required for survival. And once the law had shaped such men, it had also put a surprising weapon into the hands of those who seemed weaker. This brutal honor system, designed to maintain male dominance, inadvertently placed a terrifying weapon in the hands of those Viking society considered weaker: free women. In a world where a single word could destroy a warrior, the fatal blow often came not from an enemy's axe, but from a wife's whisper in her own home. Viking women, especially those of high status, had rights their sisters across Europe could only dream of. They could own land, run businesses, and most importantly, they had the right to divorce. But it was the reasons they could use to end a marriage that truly revealed their subtle and ruthless power. A woman could divorce her husband not just because he was abusive or unsupportive. She could leave him because he was not manly enough. The Icelandic sagas, the bloody chronicles of feuds, are full of stories of great men being ruined by their women. In Laxdæla saga, one of the most famous, a powerful woman divorces her husband and completely destroys his social standing. The reason she gives to the community? He is too gentle in bed. This accusation, spoken publicly, is sharper than any blade. It does not simply say that he is a bad lover. It implicitly declares him a ragger. It triggers the very legal switch we have seen, putting him in the position of having to prove his manhood or accept eternal disgrace. Picture the scene. At a public gathering, a wife, with a stony face, announces that her husband is unable to perform his duties. Immediately, all eyes turn to the husband. Murmurs arise, snickers from former friends and allies. His wife's accusations do not require proof in the usual way. In Viking culture, a free woman's word about what happens in the bedroom carries a special weight. She is the sole witness to the most important aspect of masculine honor. By weaponizing intimacy, she has turned the marriage bed into a court of law, and she is judge, jury, and executioner. This power is not limited to the bedroom. In Jarl's saga, Haldr divorces her first husband for slapping her. But the revenge does not stop there. She incites her foster father to kill him in revenge for the insult. Another woman might divorce her husband for dressing too femininely, or for not being fierce enough to defend the family honor. Each of these complaints, however seemingly minor, is a direct attack on the concepts of urgy and ragger. It turns married life into a constant test of masculinity, where the wife holds the power of judgment. This created a surprising paradox. In a society that worshipped male aggression, women were able to use those same rules to control their own destinies. They did not overthrow the patriarchal system. They learned to manipulate it with mastery. They understood that the quickest way to destroy a man was not physical confrontation, but an attack on the foundation of his honor. They turned whispers, rumors, and public complaints into effective weapons of psychological warfare. But this power came at a price. It only applied to free women, and it was built on the acceptance and reinforcement of that brutal system. The ability of a free woman to destroy a man was based on the existence of a rigid hierarchy. And at the bottom of that hierarchy was a completely different group of people whose fates revealed the true dark side of Viking power. If the power of a free Viking woman was built on her ability to enforce a code of honor, that honor was itself defined by the existence of class that had no honor, no rights, no nothing. At the bottom of Viking society were the thralls, the slaves. And to understand the Viking machine, we must see them not just as warriors, but as traffickers on an industrial scale. Their raids were not just for gold. They were for people. Flesh, skin, and blood were a commodity more precious than metal, and they powered a brutal economic machine powered by the body. The great Viking trading centers of Dublin and York were more than just places for the exchange of goods and spices. They were the most notorious centers of human trafficking in Europe. Imagine open-air markets where captives from every known land, from Ireland, England, France, all the way to the Slavic lands, were displayed like animals, their teeth, muscles, and beauty examined before the cold eyes of buyers. The sagas describe with dispassionate clarity how warriors divided up the human booty after a successful raid. Women and children were lined up, and the chieftains were given the option of choosing the most desirable for their personal collection. The language they used was not about people, but about property. This dehumanization was not just a cultural attitude. It was embedded in the law. This is where the contrast between free women and slaves became most stark and revolting. The medieval Icelandic code stipulated that the rape of a free woman was punishable by death or outlawed. It was an almost absolute protection, a recognition of a woman's bodily autonomy. But for a slave woman, the code was completely silent. The rape of a slave woman was not considered a crime against a person. It was treated as an act of damaging property. The offender did not face death, but only had to pay a fine to the slave's owner, equivalent to crippling a horse or damaging a cart. Any free man could sexually exploit a female slave without any consequences. If she resisted and was killed, her death was a small financial loss for her master. The scale of the system was staggering. Archaeological evidence from Viking settlements in Dublin suggests that as many as 30% of the population were slaves. Stop and think about that number. For every 3 people you meet on the streets of a thriving Viking city, one is a kidnapped life, stripped of everything, and most likely subjected to daily sexual exploitation. This was not a fringe phenomenon. It was the foundation of their economy and society. A constant flow of new bodies was essential to maintaining the lifestyle, wealth, and power of the free class. And this economic machine served a dual purpose, an even darker strategic one. It did not simply enrich the Vikings. It was also a psychological weapon. The reputation of the slave markets and the fate of captured women preceded the longships. For many communities, the horror of having their wives, children, and sisters taken away, treated as objects, and sexually abused was more terrifying than death on the battlefield. The existence of an economy based on sexual slavery turned the threat of sexual violence into an effective tool of conquest. Often, the mere news of the approach of Viking ships was enough to cause towns to surrender without a fight. Why fight and see your loved ones dragged away in chains, when surrender might bring a less gruesome end? In this way, the Vikings turned humiliation into an art, a tool to break the will of their enemies before the first axe was even swung. If the fear of sexual slavery was a long-range weapon, a specter that struck terror before the longships arrived, then on the battlefield the Vikings perfected methods of close contact that were even more terrifying. They turned sexual violence into an art of psychological destruction, a calculated strategy more effective than the sharpest axes. They understood a cruel truth. To conquer a people, you must first break the spirit of its men. And the most effective way to do that was to strike at the very core of masculinity. One of the most terrifying manifestations of this strategy was the clamhog, the humiliating slash. This was not a mortal wound intended to finish off an opponent. It was worse. After defeating an enemy, a Viking warrior would slash or stab his victim in the buttocks. This was a highly symbolic act, and everyone present understood its meaning. It represented anal penetration. It was a way to brand the enemy with a ragger, turning him into a passive, sexually subjugated person right in front of his comrades. Its brutality lay in the fact that it destroyed a man's honor without the need for actual sexual intercourse. It was a coded form of humiliation, a clear message that the victim was not only defeated, but also turned into a woman. But the Vikings did not always stop at the symbolic level. For important enemies, especially chieftains and fierce warriors, they used even more direct methods. Sagas such as the Volsunga saga describe captured kings being subjected to public rape, a spectacle designed to represent total and utter defeat. For the Vikings, this was more than just an act of humiliation. It had supernatural, demonic significance. They believed that Hamingja, or Megan, a person's essence, luck, and masculine power, could be stolen through the imposition of a passive sexual role. When a Viking warrior raped an enemy chieftain, he believed he was literally sucking the victim's strength, courage, and masculine essence and adding it to his own. It was a transfer of power in its most primal and gruesome form. The psychological impact of these acts was one of deliberate destruction. A sexually abused warrior could never return home and continue his life. In the eyes of his community, he was tainted, forever marked as weak, a ragger. He became a living symbol of the tribe's failure and humiliation. His own relatives would shun him. Faced with a life without honor, many victims committed suicide. Others became outcasts, wandering aimlessly, living ghosts reminding them of the Vikings' absolute dominance. This was psychological warfare at its finest. The Vikings had turned their internal notions of sexual honor into foreign policy. They did not come simply to pillage and kill. They came to dismantle the entire social structure of their enemies by striking at its foundation, the pride and honor of men. Killing a king would create a martyr. Humiliating and breaking him would create a cautionary tale that would paralyze his people for generations. This violence was not the chaos of battle. It was the methodical, cold application of their deepest cultural principles to their enemies. If this was how they treated the outside world, it raises a disturbing question. How did they apply this brutal logic to their own people? If the Vikings applied such brutal logic to their enemies, how did they treat their own criminals? The answer lies in a shocking truth. For the Vikings, justice and brutal entertainment were one and the same. Their legal system was not simply a punishment. It was a grand theater, a theater of pain designed to educate, deter, and most importantly, entertain the masses. When a Viking committed a crime, especially a sexual crime, the punishment was not just a payment, but a public spectacle, a macabre play where humiliation was brought to a crescendo. Imagine a public square, not for markets, but for executions. A man convicted of raping a free woman would face a gruesomely ironic punishment. He might not only be killed, but would be subjected to public sexual assault before he died. The crowd would cheer as justice was served through the violence he had inflicted. An adulterer might be castrated in front of an entire community who would view the procedure as a sporting event. The individual's pain and humiliation would become a collective spectacle, a vivid reminder of social norms and the consequences of breaking them. The line between justice and entertainment was completely blurred during the festivals. Sagas, such as the saga of the Jomsborg Vikings, tell of brutal tournaments where captured prisoners or convicted criminals became the focus of sick entertainment. Crowds would bet on how long a victim could endure increasingly elaborate and painful forms of sexual torture until they died or went insane. These events were not clandestine acts of secrecy. They were a scheduled part of community life, a way for Vikings to vent while simultaneously reinforcing their core values of power and dominance. These stories may sound like the hyperbole of their enemies, but the archaeological evidence tells a chillingly similar story. Execution sites excavated across Scandinavia show signs of ritual violence that went far beyond what was necessary to take a human life. Bodies were mutilated in systematic ways, with injuries focused on parts of the body that held symbolic sexual and humiliating meanings. These skeletons are silent witnesses to a culture where death was accompanied by humiliation and punishment was an artistic display of brutality. This system served multiple purposes. It was clearly an effective deterrent, but more importantly, it normalized extreme violence. A child raised in a society where castration or sexual torture was a form of public entertainment would have a completely different threshold for accepting violence. The domestic theater of brutality was a training ground for the theater of war abroad. It produced warriors who were not only desensitized to bloodshed, but who viewed humiliation and torture as valid, even praiseworthy, tools. It explains how Viking raiders were able to carry out such systematic atrocities in their conquests. They were not violating social norms. They were following a cultural script that had been drilled into their minds since childhood. The Viking world was a place where law, violence, and entertainment were not clearly separated. They were all woven together into a complex and bloody tapestry of social control. If punishment and death were so public and ritualized, another question arises. How do they treat the beginning of life, the creation of a new family? If this was how they dealt with darkness, how do they celebrate light? If the Vikings faced death and punishment with a public spectacle, then they approached the beginning of a new family with a chillingly similar logic. Forget modern notions of love, romance, and privacy. A Viking wedding was not a celebration of two souls in harmony. It was a business transaction, a political alliance, and a test of sexual performance closely monitored by the community. Intimacy was not a private moment to be cherished. It was a public act that had to be authenticated for the marriage contract to be valid. Everything about the ceremony revolves around wealth, lineage, and sex. One of the central rituals involves placing a replica of Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, on the bride's lap. For all present, its meaning is unambiguous. It is an unmistakable phallic symbol, a prayer for fertility, and a public acknowledgement of the sexual act about to take place. When the groom removes the bride's crown in front of the guests, it is a clear signal to everyone that he is about to take her virginity, fulfilling his part of the contract. But the climax of this public scrutiny came after the party was over. The newlyweds were not allowed a moment of privacy. They were escorted by family members and trusted witnesses to the wedding bed. Meanwhile, priests would bless the bed with fertility prayers, essentially sanctified profanities, detailing the sexual acts they were expecting. And then the unthinkable happened. The consummation, the couple's first intimate moment, took place under some form of surveillance. In many cases, family members would wait just outside the door, listening for sounds to confirm that the transaction had been completed. In more important cases, especially when involving powerful families and large dowries, the supervision was even more direct. The saga of Grettir the Strong describes a wedding where the bride's uncle stayed in the bridal chamber to ensure the marriage was properly consummated. Imagine that. A family member acts as a supervisor for your first sexual act to ensure its legality. The next morning, the bloodstained bedsheet would be examined and sometimes proudly displayed. It was more than just proof of the bride's virginity. It was a legal document, a receipt confirming that the contract had been successfully performed. The sheet could be presented in court if there were any future disputes about the marriage. The consequences of failing this test are severe. If the bride is no longer a virgin, her family can be sued for commercial fraud. If the groom fails to perform, the bride's family can claim compensation for damaged goods. The bride's reputation has been tarnished. Icelandic laws even prescribe specific penalties for various sexual failures on the wedding night, treating intimacy as a term in a business contract. In the cold Viking worldview, love was an unnecessary luxury when dowries and political alliances were at stake. The emotions of the bride and groom were completely irrelevant compared to the legal and financial obligations of their sexual performance. The creation of life was stripped of all privacy and turned into a public ritual, a supervised transaction. If they treated the creation of life in such a mechanical and ritualistic way, what would happen when they tried to use that same sexual energy to commune with death? The answer to that question came from an unlikely witness, an Arab diplomat and traveler named Ahmad ibn Fadlan. In 922 AD, while traveling along the Volga River, he witnessed a Viking funeral rite. His detailed and chillingly objective account painted a picture so horrifying that for centuries historians dismissed it as the exaggeration of an uncultured outsider. But then archaeology spoke up, and the pickaxes of scientists unearthed a truth even more terrifying than Ibn Fadlan had written. When a Viking chieftain died, his funeral was not a mournful event, but a 10-day ritual of transferring power. The Vikings believed that a leader needed strength and vitality in the afterlife as well as in this one. And they believed that sexual energy was the most powerful life force that could be transferred from the living to the dead. The ritual began with a question posed to the female slaves of the deceased chieftain. "Which of you will die with him?" In silence, a girl would step forward. She volunteered, believing that this was not a death, but an elevation. She would become her master's eternal companion in Valhalla, the ultimate honor. From that moment, her fate was sealed, and she entered the final days of her life, a series of rituals that the modern mind could hardly comprehend. The girl was treated like a queen. She was dressed in the finest clothes, fed the finest food, and intoxicated with strong alcoholic beverages. She became a sacred thing, a living vessel, and that jar had to be filled. Every day, she was brought to the most important men in the tribe. Each one would have sex with her. Ibn Fadlan records a startling detail. After each intercourse, the man would say to the girl, "Tell your master that I did this purely out of love for him." This was not some orgy. In their worldview, it was a deeply religious act. They truly believed that they were transferring their essence, their strength, their life force into the girl's body. She was accumulating the life energy of the entire tribe to carry it into the afterlife for their leader. On the 10th day, the day of the cremation, the ritual reached its climax. The girl, now nearly insane from alcohol and possibly drugs, was led to the funeral ship where the sheik's body had been laid out. Here, the last 6 men, the sheik's closest associates, entered the tent and had intercourse with her in turn. Ibn Fadlan recorded clinically. Then they laid her down beside her master. An old woman, known as the Angel of Death, approached. She and 2 other men placed a rope around the girl's neck, while the old woman drew a dagger. As the 2 men tightened the rope, the Angel of Death repeatedly stabbed the knife between the girl's ribs. Death came from both sides at once, a combination of suffocation and blood loss. Finally, the ship was set on fire. As the fire raged, consuming the ship, the bodies of the chief and the slave girl, the tribe stood on the shore chanting and beating drums, believing they had successfully sent their leader to the afterlife with full strength and vitality. The Oseberg ship grave in Norway, containing the remains of two women, one of high status and the other of a violent death, seems to be a silent echo of this ritual. From our perspective, it is one of the most systematic and gruesome examples of sexual violence disguised as religion. But from the Vikings' perspective, they gave a slave girl the highest honor. They made her a divine messenger, a goddess who carried their power into eternity. The clash of these two perspectives is the abyss that separates our world from theirs, a place where reverence and brutality can be one. The world of the Vikings, with its brutal sexual rituals, its domination-based legal system, and its fusion of religion and violence, seems 1,000 years and a moral abyss away. It would be easy to close the history books and dismiss them as a barbaric chapter, a bizarre mutation erased by time. But to do so would be to deceive ourselves. For the physical acts may be buried, but its legacy, an invisible legacy of thought and power, still resonates in our modern world in disturbing ways. The Vikings didn't just raid and leave. They stayed. They settled, mingled, and ruled. Their blood flowed through the veins of millions of Europeans, from the Normans of France, who conquered England, to the Rus who founded Russia. They didn't just leave DNA. They planted cultural DNA. Their concepts of law, personal honor, and authority structures were absorbed and transformed, becoming part of the foundation on which Western society was built. Consider the core concept, the concept of the ragger. The ultimate horror of a Viking man was being seen as passive, effeminate, as someone who was penetrated. Now listen to the worst insults in modern society. The most vile insults hurled at a man are often not about his intelligence or wealth. They attack his masculinity, often using homophobic slurs, comparing him to women, or implying sexual weakness. Is the pressure to be strong, to be in control, to be the initiator in every aspect of life, from the boardroom to the bedroom, not a distant echo of the fear of being called a ragger? The cycle of violence we saw, where men are constantly required to prove their dominance through aggression, still exists. It may no longer be a blood oath, but it manifests itself in gang culture, in schoolyard brawls, in the ruthless power dynamics of the corporate world, and in the societal pressure for men to suppress their emotions for fear of being seen as weak. The obsession with maintaining an impenetrable image of masculinity is a direct legacy of the Viking worldview. Furthermore, the Viking social model, with a freedom of one group, free women, was defined and reinforced by the absolute oppression of another group, slaves, is a tragic pattern that has been repeated over and over again in history. The Vikings simply practiced it with brutal honesty, without any veil of hypocrisy. They showed a naked truth. Sometimes, our freedom is built on the misfortune of others. The world of Vikings is not a distant, irrelevant horror story. It is a dark mirror. It reflects what can happen when sex, violence, and power are allowed to mingle unchecked by compassion. It shows a system of logic that, once established, can justify unimaginable atrocities in the name of law, religion, and honor. The specific customs have disappeared, but that basic logic still lurks in the dark corners of civilization. Axes have been replaced by more sophisticated tools, but the struggle for dominance and the fear of being subjugated remain an undeniable part of the Viking legacy. Our journey through the sexual worldview of the Vikings comes to an end. We have delved into the darkest corners of a culture as complex as it is terrifying, one whose rules of power, honor, and survival are radically different from our own. Looking directly at these mores can be uncomfortable, even revolting. But the purpose of history is not to seek comfort, but to seek truth, however thorny. It is easy to judge the Vikings through the lens of 21st century morality, but it also misses a more important lesson. By trying to understand their internal logic, however alien it may be, we begin to see that humans are not immutable creatures. What we consider sacred, they may consider a tool. What we consider love, they may consider a contract. They were not irrational monsters. They were people operating under a different set of rules, shaped by a harsh environment and a cruel worldview. And of course, they were not all about violence and domination. They were also great seafarers who crossed oceans where no one else dared, traders who connected civilizations, artisans who created intricate works of art, and lawmakers who left behind far-reaching codes. Their history, like our own, is a tangle of light and dark. Exploring their darkest chapters is not to condemn, but to remind us of what humans are capable of, both of incredible creativity and systematic brutality. By understanding them, perhaps we can better understand ourselves.